what this election has demonstrated is that people are quite sick of traditional politics.
I didn't grow up wanting to be a politician. I'm a plumber. I am no different to every single person here in this constituency. I work hard. That is what we do.
How do these political parties adapt to that? And, Labour, it's a real sort of crisis for them. I think they'll have to do some real soul searching. I think we are moving into an era of multi-party politics.
Well, joining me is Hannah Al-Othman. Thanks so much for joining us. Quite literally just off the train from Manchester, where you've been up covering the GortonandDenton by-election. Have you had any sleep?
2 hours, maybe.
Oh, okay. Better than zero. In the last few weeks, it's just been this case of it's just too close to call. And when I was going to bed late-ish last night, about 2:30, it was still very unclear, although there were signs that the Greens were starting to make some real advances. Obviously, it wasn't a close victory at all. It was a massive endorsement of the Greens. What was the vibe like overnight and this morning?
So when we were at the count, sort of when we got there, we were prepared, we'd got our snacks in, we've got our big bottles of Diet Coke because we thought we might be in, several recount territory. Yeah. Obviously, the last one in Runcorn and Helsby, that went down to 6 votes. So that was kind of what we were prepared for. But before they count the votes, they sort of verify them all. And each party have people observing, and they sort of start taking a tally of what they can see from those ballot papers. And so, that was quite clear before any votes had even been counted that the Greens were going to win it. And they were very cautious. They weren't counting any chickens. And really, then we're saying, well, who's going to be in second place? And it was, is it going to be Reform or is it going to be Labour? So that sort of became what we were watching out for as the night progressed.
Yeah, and Labour in third position, which was kind of their worst case scenario, wasn't it? And we'll talk about the implications for Labour in a minute. But let's talk about Hannah Spencer, who's just become a new MP, former plumber. I mean, she's been a really fantastic candidate, hasn't she, in terms of her visibility socially, but also in this sort of new thing for the Green Party, which is really courting the working class vote. We were talking to Owen Jones yesterday about how well they're kind of rebranding to move away from the kind of more old school traditional middle class perceptions of what the Green Party is. You've met her a few times. What do you think has such cut through in that constituency?
Yeah, I mean, she felt very different as an election candidate. And I think, what this election has demonstrated is that people are quite sick of traditional politics. I think, that's what the past sort of, last 18 months or so, people are fed up of, I don't know what you'd call sort of mainstream politics, and they're looking for something different. She comes across as very much, and she'll admit this herself, when I met her, she said, this is all very new to me. And, she did run against Andy Burnham for mayor. She is a councillor in Manchester, so she's not brand new to politics, but obviously being thrust into the national spotlight in a by-election is very, very different. But yeah, her approach was just, she brought her rescue greyhounds everywhere. She's got, I think, 4 rescue greyhounds. She's filming TikTok videos.
And she was
all
still
the time.
working as a plumber.
And so I arranged to meet her, and I said, it'd be really good for me if we could meet earlier in the week because I need some time to file at the end of the week. So it was like a longer piece, and her spokesperson that was organising it through, where she was like, well, she's doing a plastering course on Monday and Tuesday, so she can't meet you until later in the week. So yeah, I think she finished that during the election campaign.
But that goes to show that she wasn't sure that she was going to win, right? And she was just talking about that in her victory speech this morning of I took on this plastering course during the campaign because I thought I might need something to do afterwards. And she also said that she was going to have to give a couple of clients for plumbing jobs a ring to say that she was going to be quite busy. So a really fantastic result for the Greens. And I think a really interesting example of how they are now able to run, a national campaign type operation, which will obviously be key as we move into May. But let's talk about Labour, because certainly the messaging from Number 10 was that they were pretty confident that it was going to be close, but they would scrape it. But they're in third place. Lots of criticism this morning, criticism specifically about the decision, obviously, to bar Andy Burnham from running in that seat.
Yeah, sort of the messages I was getting from people I know in Manchester Labour were a bit more, they were managing expectations a little bit more, and they were closer to it. So But they definitely thought they were in with a chance. It was very much this could go any one of three ways. They threw everything at it. Like, I live in the constituency, so I've seen it all play out firsthand. I've had every single leaflet through my door.
And Starmer went to visit as well.
Starmer went to visit, which, they tend to stay away if they think they're definitely going to lose it. So that was an indication they thought they were maybe in with a chance. I had far more Labour at the door far more times than any other party. I think no one doubts that if Andy Burnham had been the candidate, he probably would have won, and he probably would have won it quite comfortably. But I can also see, why Labour didn't want to do that, because we've had this result play out where Labour were in third, and that's for one parliamentary seat out of 650. But if they'd have had a mayoral by-election, I think we could foreseeably have ended up with the same result there. Yeah. And Labour, losing what's arguably their second most important mayoralty, and, potentially even coming third. So, you can see why they made that calculation. Plus, if Burnham was in Parliament, then,
the challenge to Starmer.
The challenge to Starmer was the perceived wisdom.
And Gaza was a big issue on the doorstep. GortonandDenton has a large Muslim population. But I was just looking at a tweet from our colleague Patrick Wintle that I thought was so interesting. I mean, rightly, the importance of Gaza amongst Muslims living in the constituency has been heard, and that has shown up in the result today. But it's also not just Muslim voters, is it, at all? It's people who care about what's happening in Gaza, whatever political affiliations that they may have. But that is something that Labour really need to take more seriously as we approach May and the 2029 elections.
I'd say the election was not very heavily policy focused. It was more driven by, a need for change. Yeah. The candidates, as we said, Hannah Spence had all this energy behind her and people felt, very enthused by that. But I'd say the exception was Gaza. People, when people raised a policy or an issue, it was Gaza, and it wasn't just Muslim voters.
And let's just talk about reform and Nigel Farage for a second. I'd imagine they're fairly happy with second place, but Nigel Farage has gone sort of fairly Trump, saying there's this talk about election fraud and this election being a victory for sectarian voting and cheating. There was something about family voting on X last night, and that also sets a worrying precedent, doesn't it?
Yeah, so this family voting story broke last night, which is essentially where sort of more than one person, presumably the same household, will go into the polling station together, and one will perhaps oversee the other's vote and direct them to vote in a certain way. So that was immediately seized on by Reform, and I stood right behind Goodwin when he was saying, that it was very Trumpian, that essentially the election had been stolen from them by Islamists and woke progressives, was the phrase that he used. But yeah, he later, he didn't directly refer to that there, but I think he later put out a statement online referring to this. So, I think Reform were always going to seize on that, and it was a dirty fight. I think, all three of the main parties were referred to the police. There was a lot of dishonesty on leaflets. So, it was a dirty fight, and I think Reform were always going to, claim an unfair victory. But I think with the majority that decisive, it was more difficult for them to do so. If it had been closer, that might have carried more weight.
It is feeling like something of quite a seismic shift in politics this morning, isn't it? I mean, Labour had 50% plus of the vote in GortonandDenton in the last election. They've now gone down to 25%. The Greens have shot up from 13 to 40%. Tories at less than 2%. Can we look at this as a seismic shift, or do you think there are particularities to this constituency that means it won't necessarily play out around the country in the same way?
I think it certainly gives, the main party, specifically in this case Labour, sort of, I think it will ring serious alarm bells. By-elections are different, but I think what it's shown is, certainly for all my lifetime, we've essentially had a two-party system. Yeah. And, people would be afraid to vote beyond Labour, Tory, in some areas Lib Dem. They thought they might be wasting their vote. apart from in maybe a certain number of seats, like Brighton's voted Green for a long time, but in many places, in Manchester certainly, people have been wary of voting Green. But now what this by-election has proved, and what Helsby and the last general election proved, is you can vote for reform, you can vote for Greens, and they do stand a chance of winning. And I think we are moving into an era of multi-party politics. How do these political parties adapt to that? And Labour, it's a real sort of crisis for them, because in Runcorn they lost votes sort of on, I suppose, what you'd call the right. They're sort of what you'd maybe describe as a traditional working class voter base who are more socially conservative, and now they've lost sort of in the liberal, progressive, young students, Muslims. So it's what's left for them? It's the centrists, but is that enough to sustain the Labour Party? Probably not. So I think they'll have to do some real soul searching. And I think been speaking to people in Labour this morning, and they're already really, really worried about what's going to happen in May, which is the next big test, the local elections.
Hannah, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.